Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Now, in the quick events, and the events were very quickly disseminated because the telegraph is able to quickly spread the news. And because of this, there's information that is inaccurate. We see here, death of Seward. So the early reports are that Secretary Seward and the president have both been killed. And in the earliest reports, people heard, well, did you hear the president was killed or the president was shot? Did you hear the Secretary of State was stabbed? And people might say, well, no, it wasn't Seward, it was Lincoln. No, it wasn't Lincoln, it was Seward. And they would go back and forth until they realized, well, maybe it was both of them. But the news spreads quickly, and this is one of the things that does Booth in, because he can only travel so fast, and he can't outrun the singing wire. And the manhunt, the news disseminates over the period of the 12 days. And he does the best that he can to avoid capture, but ultimately he can't get away with it. This is the sign outside the Sarat House and Tavern. This is the first stop that Booth made after he crossed the bridge. Next slide, please. A shot of the home. Next slide. Another shot, which you see the sign and the home. Now, he arrives at this site, as I said, on midnight, and he rousts John Lloyd, who's the tenant, who's been given the instructions, and he collects the packages. And at this point, he actually boasts to Lloyd, I've killed Lincoln, and I think we got Seward too. So at this point, he's boasting about it. That changes as we go. Next slide. And this is a shot inside the main entrance, a portrait of Mary Sarat. The place was an inn, a tavern, and a post office. It also was a Confederate safe house. It was a place where spies would meet, where intelligence would be shared. This is where the guns were hidden, in between the wall framing and the floor. That's an example. Next shot. You can see that there's probably about 8 inches or so. And the rifles were lowered down this area. And later, this was used as evidence of Mrs. Sarat's involvement in the conspiracy, the fact that she was the owner of this building. And this is a placard that tells you the story of that. That's on the scene. The weapons were planted there earlier in March after a failed kidnapping attempt. And it says here, get the irons ready, have the shooting irons ready for parties that would call that night. And a complete description of these events are in Lloyd's testimony. And she went to the gallows as a result of his testimony and Weichman's testimony. Next shot. This is a model at the Sarat House of the Ford's Theater. Next shot. A model of the Sarat House at the Sarat House. That's a model of Garrett's farm where Booth ultimately was killed. And last is a model depicting the hanging of the 4. And one thing that's not visible in the picture, as you can see here, their graves were dug before they were hanged, and they saw their graves right next to the gallows. And that doesn't come up in the pictures that are later, but one of the things that is fun is they're holding umbrellas over these guys as they're noosing them up, because it's July in Washington, it's searing summer sun, and they're holding umbrellas over them. Next shot, please. This is a plaque detailing the events of Booth stopping April 14th to collect the weapons, and then on to TB, and then to Dr. Mudds, who set his leg. Next shot, please. It's a placard that they erected telling about the events that took place over there. Another shot about the Sarat Tavern. Sarat's son John was a Confederate spy and courier, and I think that's the real reason why they went after her as hard as they did. I think she was involved, but I think if her son had been tried, I don't think she would have been executed, but that's just my opinion. And the other thing that's fun and interesting is Powell. If Powell had made it out of Washington that night, he might have been lost to history, because the early reports thought that Powell was Sarat. The early reports said that it was her son that tried to kill the Secretary of State. This is Dr. Mudd's home. One shot from the backside. Next slide, please. Another shot from the house further away. One more. Further from the backside of the house. Next shot. This is the bed in which Booth slept and his leg was set. This is on the second floor of the home. And Dr. Mudd, the first time he's questioned, insists he didn't know the men. He knew Booth. He might not have known Harold, but he knew Booth. He insists he didn't know the men and they only stayed briefly. He doesn't mention anything about them going upstairs to sleep, spending the night. And he mentions that Booth, he lent Booth a razor. And he doesn't mention that it's Booth. He says it was a stranger. Lent the stranger a razor. He shaved his mustache. And he also claims that he had a beard, which he didn't have. So he's providing some details that are accurate and some details that are inaccurate. And he tells them that when they left, they asked for directions, and he gave them directions to the home of a Union loyalist, which was in an opposite direction from the one that they went in. And, you know, the investigators are very skeptical, but they go to the trouble of going to the home of this loyal Union man and questioning him, just to be thorough. And so they clearly, in the hour's interview that they conduct with Mudd on the 18th of April, they're clearly disquieted by what they hear. And if he thinks that he was able to quell their suspicions, he's totally incorrect, because they know that he's not told them the entire truth. And in fact, he's told them some falsehoods. That's a shot from the back of the house, or the front of the house, actually. This is the room in which Booth stayed, the middle room on the second floor. Next shot. This is the boot that Dr. Mudd cuts off his leg. And in the second interview, when they go back to interview him a second time, now the manhunt and the dragnet, it's like 3 or 4 days later, and the countryside is buzzing with all kinds of men of material who are looking all over for this guy. And one of the things that Mudd did early on was he relayed the information to his second cousin, who was also a doctor named Mudd. But his second cousin was a loyal Union man. So he relays the information 2 days after, Easter Sunday, to his cousin, and asks his cousin to contact the Union people. He thinks that by providing his cousin as the channel, it might look more favorable on him, but his cousin actually delays. So that's a source of further delay in the authorities getting the information. So when they come a second time to question him some more, now all kinds of additional details come up that he left out from earlier. Oh, well, the men were armed. You know, most of us, I think, that'd be one of the first things that we would tell them. So that arouses more suspicion. They had lots of money, too. And he tells them that. That's not a detail. And then they start bringing him in, and they search the house again. And now his wife volunteers, or he volunteers, that he has a boot. And they collect the boot from upstairs in a hiding place, which reveals now that he had stayed a lot longer than had been first told. And the boot inside has 2 pieces of writing. One is the name of the custom house in New York where it was made, and also inscribed inside the leather is J. Wilkes. So it's ironclad evidence that can't be disputed that Mudd has worked on the president's assassin. And even after this, he continues to maintain. Then he also acknowledges that he had met Booth before, but he insists this man wasn't Booth. So, I mean, the stories that he tells just are blowing in the wind like a flag. They go one direction and another direction. Next slide, please. Plaque on the side of the Mudd home. Next slide. The route that Booth and Harold took as they tried to continue their escape. Next slide. And then a plaque detailing what happened there. And I think the larger story of Mudd's life is the redemption. Because, you know, yes, he was involved in some way, and yes, he was involved in an ongoing way because of the way he frustrates the investigation. But then after all that, he is very helpful when there's a yellow fever outbreak in the Dry Tortugas, and he's pardoned. and he becomes a leader in the community. And he actually, I believe, was a delegate for Governor Tilden when Tilden ran for president in the election of 1876. So I think that's the larger message of his life, is that he's capable of redeeming himself in some way, even though he was associated with these vile events. And a lot of the people who've labored in vain for under 43 years to clear his name are his descendants, and obviously, they have an axe to grind. They'd like to have the record cleared, and unfortunately, I think he's damned to history because of the things that he did all the way through. Next slide, please. Another plaque about the home of Dr. Mudd, erected by Charles County Civil War Centennial Commission. And Charles County, by the way, was a hotbed of secessionist tendencies. In the election of 1860, out of like 1,100 votes cast, Lincoln got 6. So that's what you call a landslide. Next slide. This is the church in Bryantown, St. Mary's Church in Bryantown, where Booth and Mudd met in November and December of 1864. It's also in the graveyard where Dr. Mudd is buried. Next slide. This is Rich Hill. This was the house to which Booth and Harold were seeking to arrive after they left Dr. Mudd's. They arrived here shortly after midnight on April the 16th. They got lost in the Maryland countryside, and they enlist as a guide a fellow by the name of Oswell Swan, and a man who's ironically half black and half Piscataway Indian. So again, this white supremacist is relying on help from people who he feels are inferior to get him where he wants to go. Swan is paid $7 for his services. He guides them across the Zacchaeus Swamp, and Swan would give testimony that Cox admitted the two men to his home, Booth and Harold, where they remained for 3 or 4 hours. This was a claim that Cox would deny, and it would be corroborated by the testimony of one of his servants. But whether or not he actually admitted them to the home, he did assist in their concealment in the pine thicket from April 16th through April 21st, and he put them into contact with his foster brother, Thomas A. Jones, who was a federal or a Confederate agent, and who helped get them across the Potomac to Virginia. Next slide, please. That's what the home looked like then. The next slide, this is what the home looks like today. Some of the sites are kind of run down on the tour. And I think one of the things that is interesting is the notion that they stayed put in a camouflaged area, and this incredible whirlpool surrounded them. They laid low, and that created a different set of problems for them. Next slide, please. Pine Thicket is where Booth and Harold spent 5 days hiding from the authorities. Next picture. Another plaque detailing, historical plaque detailing those events. And this is what the Pine Thicket looks like today. Thomas A. Jones secrets them there, and Booth says, okay, well, I want newspapers. He wants to read about the reviews of his performance. This vain guy. And a couple of other things. They need to be supplied. And they still have the horses. And the horses need to be supplied. And from the Pine Thicket, they can hear columns of soldiers and other people moving around. So the decision is made. Jones says, listen to him. Listen, guys, I can provide you rations, but I can't provide for these animals without providing suspicious behavior. I mean, I'm going to be stopped on the road, and I'm going to have all of this stuff. What am I going to say I'm doing? So Booth gives his loyal servant, Harold, the responsibility of killing the horses, which he does. He brings them down to a morass of quicksand about a mile from the Pine Thicket, and he shoots them. And he sinks them fully loaded with saddles and everything. And to this day, the remains of those horses have not yet been found. So that's one of the pieces of the puzzle that someday maybe somebody will say, oh, and what is this? And then a historian will come in and say that's probably the remains of these two horses. So Booth learns during this period that the nation does not share his assessment of his act. It's viewed even in the South, especially in the South, because the South, the wealthy Southerners now see the war is over, and it can go easy or it can go hard. And they want it to go easy. And so they're looking to be as conciliatory as possible, and now this guy goes and does this. So it's pretty much uniformly condemned. Next slide, please. This is a carte de visite that's been defaced by one of Lincoln's hunters, I would imagine. It says, he said, no cowardly. I can't read it from this side, but basically he's saying that like a viper he lived, like a dog died, and like a dog buried. That's one person's editorial comment about John Wilkes Booth. Next slide, please. This is the home of Cox. Oh, no, excuse me. This is the home of Thomas Jones, which is called Huckleberry. And that's from this base of operations, he was able to sustain and supply Booth and Harold for 5 days while they were in the pine thicket. And there was an elaborate code that they had, because they were hidden and they didn't want to reveal themselves to strangers. So as he approached, and they were armed, and any strangers that came, they wanted to kill because they wanted to continue to conceal themselves. So he was given special instructions to do a special whistling pattern as he approached. And that's how they knew that it was safe to come out from their hiding place. Next shot. Plaque detailing Huckleberry. Next shot, please. Edwin McMaster Stanton. He's a giant in this whole story. Brilliant lawyer who was at first dismissive of Lincoln's talents as a lawyer on their first meeting. He grew to respect, admire, and love Abraham Lincoln. Prior to entering service in Lincoln's cabinet in 1861, this is key, he was the first American lawyer to successfully win acquittal for his client on a murder charge using the temporary insanity defense. The case involved the 1959 murder in Lafayette Park, Washington, D.C., of Philip Barton Key, who was the son of Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. He also was the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia at that time. But he made the mistake of having a very public and torrid love affair with the wife of Daniel E. Sickles, who was a sitting member of Congress, representing New York State, by the way. The trial was the talk of Washington, D.C. in 1859 and 1860. And I think this is one of the reasons why Stanton pushed so hard for a military tribunal, because from his own experience as a lawyer, he had gotten a man who was guilty as sin off on a temporary insanity charge. And with the trial being a military tribunal, the rules of evidence would be more relaxed, and the defense techniques that could be used and employed would not necessarily be as effective. In 1861, Stanton joins Lincoln's cabinet, becomes the Secretary of War. Following the assassination, Stanton has to simultaneously deal with the loss of a dear friend while planning the specifics of the president's state funeral, making the arrangements to send his body back to Illinois for permanent interment, and directing the greatest manhunt the nation had ever seen. So he flexed his muscles. He was the effective president of the country in the immediate wake of the assassination, and this led to problems. And ultimately, later on down the road by a couple of years, he was the reason why he was one of the reasons why Vice President Johnson was impeached. The Congress passes the Tenure of Office Act over the President Johnson veto. They override the veto. And what the Tenure of Office Act says is, not only does the Senate have the power to advise and consent to appointments, which is explicitly detailed in the Constitution, but if a president wants to fire someone, that too has to be approved by the legislative branch. And the law provided that there could be a temporary furlough while the Congress wasn't in session, but that it would have to be ratified. So Johnson tries to fire Stanton, and the Congress doesn't approve, and he tries to put in somebody else's name in nomination to replace Stanton, and they impeach him, and he avoids conviction by 1 vote. Next slide, please. This is, again, the time frame elapsed now. This is April 19th. This is the funeral procession going up Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. So you see the windows are decorated appropriately, and everybody is out to be a part of the event and see the president's casket leaving Washington. Next slide, please. Alan Pinkerton, famed detective. He was responsible for secretly guiding President-elect Lincoln into Washington, D.C., amidst the rumor of his impending assassination in February of 1861. This is a guy, they say that the reason people are called private eyes is because of Pinkerton, because the logo of his company was the all-seeing eye. And his motto was, "We never sleep." Next slide, please. He manages to not find out about the assassination until April the 19th, 5 days. He's in New Orleans, and as soon as he finds out about the assassination, he sends the following obsequious telegram to Secretary Stanton. This morning's papers contain the deplorable intelligence of the assassination of President Lincoln and Secretary Seward. Under the providence of God, in February of 1861, I was unable to save him from the fate he has now met. How I regret that I had not been near him previous to that fatal act. I might have been the means to arrest it. If I can be of any service, please let me know. The service of my whole force, or life itself, is at your disposal. And I trust you will excuse me for impressing upon you the necessity of great personal caution on your part. At this time, the nation cannot spare you. And the joke, of course, is that however many men he has in his crew, Stanton's got the whole armed services of the United States at his disposal, and they're all being used. Okay. Next slide, please. This is the famous poster published by the War Department on April 20th, in which the reward was announced. And this is part of the way that the entire country was mobilized. We see pictures of Sarat, who was suspected as being the assassin or the attempted assassin of Seward, Booth, and Harold. And it says 50,000 is on Booth's head, 25 on Sarat, 25 on Harold, blah, blah, Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War. Next slide, please. And this, again, remember I said Harper's was a very respected news magazine. So in their artist renderings, they always strove for maximum accuracy. This is a artist rendering of Lincoln's body in repose at New York's City Hall on April 24th or 25th, 1865. Next slide, please. This is a photograph of the scene. And this is the only known photograph that we know of Lincoln in death.
I had heard that they weren't ever, the Army was instructed, et cetera, that no photographs were to be taken.
And this somehow slipped by. So this is the one photograph, and there may be others that we haven't discovered yet, but it's not very likely. Next shot, please. You see the two scenes side by side. Note the accuracy of the depiction here when compared with the actual events. Next shot, please. Now, this is an extraordinary photograph. This is a shot of the Lincoln funeral procession approaching Union Square in Manhattan. This building here is the home of Cornelius Van Schaik Roosevelt. And these two boys in this window here, they say, are 6-year-old Theodore, future president of the United States, and his 4-year-old brother Elliot, future father of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Next slide, please. This is the route that the Lincoln funeral train took, passed up in our part of the woods, and Lincoln's body lied in repose at the state capitol. And during that time frame, Mary Todd Lincoln stayed at Senator Harris's home in Loudonville, and I have pictures of that later in the presentation. So you see that, this was a major logistical undertaking to plan where the stops would be made, to plan what routes would be taken, what communities the train would pass through. Everybody wanted to be a part of the mourning process, and they all wanted to pay their respects. So it was a major production. This is the funeral car, the rail car that took the president's body back to Springfield. Another shot of the same rail car and the sad fate met by that rail car. It was destroyed in a prairie fire in 1911. So it's an artifact that's been lost to history. And this is a shot of the funeral in Columbus, Ohio, I believe. Next shot. And this is the hearse in which Lincoln's body was borne to the temporary tomb in Springfield. And another shot of the hearse. And then a shot of the hearse today. Next. This is what Lincoln's home looked like at the time that his body returned to Springfield. Old Bob, his horse, out in front. Next slide is a contemporary shot that I made last summer on a visit of the Lincoln home. And then the next frame has both of the pictures side by side. So it's changed very little. Next slide, please. Now we get back to Booth and Harold, who are trying to cross to Virginia, trying to cross the Potomac. And these guys, you know, they're sitting and they're stewing, and Booth is learning that he's not the heroic figure that he thought he was going to be. And he writes a self-indulgent diary entry, which I'm going to read some of it to you. It's amazing. He tries to justify for himself and to history the position that he finds himself in. Give me a second when I find this. Friday, April 21st, a week after the assassination. After being hunted like a dog through swamps, woods, and last night being chased by gunboats till I was forced to return wet, cold, and starving, with every man's hand against me, I am here in despair. And why? For doing what Brutus was honored for, what made Tell a hero. And yet I, for striking down a greater tyrant than they ever knew him, looked upon as a common cutthroat. My action was purer than either of theirs. One hoped to be great himself. The other had not only his country's, but his own wrongs to avenge. I hoped for no gain. I knew no private wrong. I struck for my country, and that alone. A country groaned beneath this tyranny and prayed for this end. Yet now, behold, the cold hand they extend to me. God cannot pardon me if I have not done wrong. Yet I cannot see any wrong except in serving a degenerate people. The little, very little I leave behind to clear my name, the government will not allow to be printed. So ends all. For my country, I have given up all that makes life sweet and holy, brought misery on my family, and I am sure there's no pardon in heaven for me, since man condemns me so. And it goes on, but I'm tired of reading it. Okay, next slide, please. This gives you an idea of how wide the Potomac is at the point that they're going to try and cross. And bear in mind, Booth is injured, so he can't help out with any of the physical stuff, and they have a rowboat. So David Harold is the one who has to do all the rowing. Next slide. That's the Maryland side of the landing. And now this side shows you, the next slide shows you how far across they had to go. It's quite a large distance. And bear in mind, remember, the clock is ticking. And every day he stays on the Maryland side, even when he gets to Virginia, there's more and more people looking for him. Next slide. This is the Virginia side. They finally make it. This is the home of Elizabeth Quisenberry, who was a Confederate agent, and they'd been given her name as a contact. She's not home when they arrive. And Harold speaks with the daughters that are home, and they send for him. When she returns, Harold mentions Thomas Jones and some other details, drops a couple of other names to impress her that he's really a friend of the cause, because we had Union detectives that were to trap people, were dressing in plain clothes, and were going out and saying and doing things to see who the Confederate spies were. So she was very right to be cautious. Thomas Jones and some other details impress her, and she offers to help. Harold indicated that the injured companion needed help to be transported, and she didn't ask for any further information. She's smart. She knows she's only going to be involved to a limited degree. She's going to provide as much help as necessary, but she doesn't want to know the details. So she calls for Thomas Harbin, another Confederate agent. Also, Harbin is Thomas Jones's brother-in-law, who helped get them across. So there's another connection. And he personally knew Booth because he had met Booth with Mudd earlier. And they get another helper to help out. And they prepare food, and they deliver the food and horses to where Booth is stationed because he's injured. And then they try to further their path. Next slide, please. They call on a home of Dr. Richard Stewart called Clydesdale. And he's a prominent Southerner, but he sees what's going on, and he understands he's not going to do anything to help these guys. He's not going to drop a dime on them, but he's not going to do anything to help these guys. So they show up at his home, and he resists the opportunity to help them. But he does allow that he'll let them come in for a meal, but that's it. He'll give them some food, and it's Southern hospitality. He has to extend, but they can't stay, and he's not going to provide any assistance. So they spend about 15 minutes inside Dr. Stewart's home. And Stewart, makes clear that they can't stay, and he's standing outside talking to the other assistants who've helped them get this far. And then he leaves them for a moment to check on the two guests. And while he leaves, these guys try to scramble to leave. So he comes back out, sees that they're leaving, and catches up to them and says, "You got to get these guys out now." And they take Booth and Harold with them. And Booth is incensed. And he later, this is how vain he is, he later hesitates to write a note upbraiding this guy for his lack of hospitality and including $2.50 as payment for the food that they enjoyed. This is a detail that he provides while he's on the run for his life. Next, this is a shot of the home as it looks today. Next shot, please. Now, this is the next stop on the path, and again, some of these buildings are run down. They meet and they get across the Rappahannock, and they get to this house. Before they get to this house, they come across a man by the name of William Rollins, who's a fisherman who's setting nets. They tell him that they want to cross the Rappahannock. Will he take them to Port Royal? And he says, well, the tide's coming in. I got to lay my nets. I can take you, but not right away. And, they offer him a dime. He said, well, I can take you, but not right away. I got to set my nets. So they want to cross right now, and Booth tries to entice him to do it now by offering a premium, offering more money. And he's not interested. So while they're having this conversation, they come across 3 Confederate soldiers, First Lieutenant Mortimer B. Ruggles, Private Absalom R. Bainbridge, and Private William S. Jett. And Jett will ultimately do him in. And at first, they start telling him a story about how they're returning Southern soldiers. They got wounded, this, that, and the other thing. And so they don't reveal who they really are. In fact, they say that they're brothers, and their name is Boyd. And they're James William Boyd and David E. Boyd. Really imaginative. So Harold then privately, after they've done this told this to the 3 of them, privately Harold tells Jett, that really is the man who assassinated Lincoln. He tells them who they really are. And the 3 of them find out who they really are. And they agree to help them. And they forge discharge papers so that if anybody stops them, it'll look legitimate. And they don't take Rollins up on his offer. They take the regular ferry to cross the Rappahannock. And this is what the home that they arrived at, a shot of the Peyton house where they arrived looks like. They arrive at the Peyton house, and Sarah Peyton is home without any men of the home being there. So she at first invites them in, and then quickly comes to the conclusion that it's not appropriate for a Southern lady to to be entertaining so many men without a man of the house there. So she tells them they have to leave. But she does volunteer that the Garrett farm, several miles up the road, might be a place for them to go. So you can do the rest of the shots of this home. They're in pretty bad shape. There's probably about 4 or 5 more. So there's a limited, in terms of the state memorializing these locations, there's a limited budget and a limited will, I think. It's almost as though the further along you get in Booth's escape, the more dilapidated the buildings become. So they leave, going to the Garrett farm. And that's what the Garrett farmhouse looked like in 1865. And this is what it looked like in the 30s before it collapsed. And the next slide has the 2 shots side by side. So the Garrett family takes in Booth. And what's interesting is Harold decides he'll leave Booth alone there. He's going to go spend that evening, the first evening, with his new friends, the Confederate soldiers that they met, Jet and the other 2. So Booth stays here alone the first night that they're there, which is the 24th of April. And Harold goes back to enjoy an evening with his new friends. And Booth is at the dinner table, and they don't know who he is, and he doesn't let on who he is. But and again, it's a performance. He's now playing the part of, an unnamed man, and he now fancifully starts discussing what the motives of the assassin might be at the dinner table. So he's, as a third party, he's having a laugh, commenting about his own motives under the guise of being, a dispassionate observer. Next slide, please. As I said, the buildings get more dilapidated as you get to the end of the road. There are no buildings left there today. There's just a plaque that says site of Garrett farmhouse and death of Booth. And this is where the tobacco barn stood. There's a sign up there against rummaging for any relics. And so you're not supposed to do that, not allowed to do that. And then here's the historical plaque that details where he was killed. But what the Confederate soldiers do is they start gathering and getting intelligence where it's more updated and they know that they're hot on the trail. And so when they catch up with Willie Jett, and they go back to Rollins, and Rollins tells them the whole story. Rollins says, oh, yeah, well, they came by and they have these carte de visites. One of them has a picture of Sarat, one of them has a picture of Harold, and one of them has a picture of Booth. And they go to Rollins and they show the Sarat picture. And he says, no, that guy didn't cross. So then they show the Harold picture and say, oh, yes, that he was one of the guys. Then they show the picture of Booth, and Rollins looks at it and says, I don't know if the guy that was with him had a mustache. And this confirms the earlier report that they had from Mudd. That was one of the things that he told that was the truth, that Booth had shaved his mustache. So they knew they were hot on the trail. And then Rollins says, oh, well, one of the Confederate soldiers that crossed with him is a guy by the name of Willie Jett. So they now have Jett's name, and Rollins' wife is even more helpful. He says, oh, yes, I believe that he was courting this one girl whose father runs this hotel in Bowling Green. So they go hot on the trail, and the family at the farmhouse where Booth is staying have become increasingly suspicious that he's not who he says he is. He's given them a story that he's a deserter and that he's wanted because he sassed some Union men. I mean, he's told them a tale that provides just enough detail that you would understand why he's a fugitive. But he doesn't tell them, he doesn't tell them the real story, obviously. But he reacts very suspiciously, and when Harold returns, he doesn't recognize him at first, and he has one of the Garrett sons get his gun belt because he doesn't know who this person is. And then when he sees it's Harold, they go out and they talk privately. And the other thing is, these two guys, when they're independently questioned by the Garretts, give different details about the same story. So they're very suspicious. And they make the two of them the following night, the night of the 25th, they have to sleep out in the barn. They no longer afford Booth the hospitality of the home. Because the other thing is, they've been asking about horses. And these guys run a farm, and they're concerned that if they're not locked up, they might steal the horses and take off, and then they'll be deprived of their economic livelihood. So they secretly lock them in the tobacco barn. And the union authorities catch up with Willie Jett, but in the process of going to the hotel where he's staying, they march right by the Garrett property. So it's quite likely that Booth and Harold heard these guys going down the road. And they roused Willie Jett, and he says, oh yeah, we dropped them off at the Garrett house. And he says, you guys came from Port Royal? You marched right past the house where he was. He says, well, I don't know if he's going to be there anymore. You know, he might have been spooked. When you guys went by, he might have taken off. So they roused him, and they make him their guide, because they figure he's going to be able to help them find the Garrett property. And they come back to the Garrett property, and then they knock on the door, and they threaten the old man, the Father Garrett. And he's a nervous guy, obviously, in the circumstance. He's not sure where they are. And they threaten to hang him right there. They throw a rope over the tree, and they say, tell me where they are. And then the son finally comes out and says, they're in the barn. And they've got several buildings on the property. So they're told, not specific enough. Which barn? So they tell him he's in a tobacco curing barn. And now these guys, the union guys, they make the Garrett sons go up there. They say, well, you're going to go up there, and you're going to unlock the lock. Oh, no, he unlocks the lock. One of the union guys unlocks the door and tells him, I'm sending a man up, and you'll surrender to him. And then they send the sons up, and the sons don't want to do it. And they threaten him and say, you don't do this, we're going to burn the whole place down, everything goes. So they send one of the sons up to try to reason with him, and Booth, again, flair for the dramatic. I mean, he's very dramatic at all times, and he probably sees this as his last great performance. And rather than just going in, which is what they should have done, there's kind of a siege that ensues, where for a couple of hours they're kind of cajoling and going back and forth. And in the process, David Harold surrenders. And he insists that this man is a stranger to him. He now starts telling a lie that he doesn't know this man, and Booth starts saying, I don't know this man. I mean, he tries to provide a groundwork whereby he can have a defense. And ultimately what winds up happening is Booth gets shot by Boston Corbett, and he's an interesting character. He was nuts. When I say he was nuts, he was nuts. This guy castrated himself. That's how crazy he was. There's records of that, and it's too unpleasant to read in the book, but it's in the book. He's nuts. And he actually winds up getting a reward, and I think that's one of the slides that's coming up, but let's see what the next slides are. This is a picture. Again, there were no photographs made of the death of Booth, so we have artist renderings. Here's a shot of the barn ablaze and Booth coming out, being shot. Next slide, please. This is Boston Corbett. One shot of him. And again, he became a celebrity. They sold pictures of him, which we now have. Next slide. There were several pictures of him. Sergeant Boston Corbett. Next slide. Next slide, please. And this is the Treasury warrant, the draft that he got. His share of the reward for killing Booth was $1,653.84, which was a lot of money back then. And then this again is the path that Booth and his accomplice took, ending on April 26, 1865. Next shot, please. Different map showing the same business. Now we have July 7th, 1865. This is the execution of the 4 conspirators. And as I told you and showed you in the earlier model, over here off the side of the picture is where the graves have been dug. Next slide. Here we have, as I told you, we have umbrellas being used to shield the condemned as they're being put into nooses from the searing sun. And next shot, the trap is sprung, and the four are, make sure I get them in the right order, Sarat, Mary Sarat is the first one. Sarat, Louis T. Powell, David E. Harold is third, left to right, and then George Atzerodt is fourth. Next shot. This is a shot of the Dry Tortugas, Fort Jefferson. This was the place where Mudd and the rest of the conspirators who weren't sentenced to death, Mudd, Spangler, Arnold, and O'Loughlin, were imprisoned. Next shot. An aerial view of the fort. Yeah, it's part of the Florida Keys. Next shot, please. This is the door to Mudd's cell. Next shot. And this is what the view would have looked like from Mudd's cell. Next shot. And this is the local connection to the story. This is Senator Harris, father of Clara Harris, senator from New York. Next slide. This is what the Loudon Cottage looked like. It's one of the oldest residences in the town. Dates to the 1830s.
Still there?
Yes. Next slide. This is a shot of what the home looked like in the 1920s. Next shot is an undated picture. You see there's a trellis with some ivy growing onto it. But you'll see that the home has changed very little from then, and I'm not sure what the date of this photo is, to now. This is a picture that I made of the home last month. And the next slide has those two shots side by side. So you can see that the architecture is very similar. The trellis isn't there, but pretty much the angles of the roofing are identical. And then the next frame has all of the four shots of the home together, the oldest. And Mary Todd Lincoln stayed in this home the night that the president's body lay in repose at the Capitol, and they say that the place is haunted. And by the way, I'm very thankful to Kevin Franklin, town historian, for helping out with access to these materials. Next shot. It was parceled out, and then this became the source of fighting, because the poster, the wanted poster, had a fixed amount of money. So then it became, well, this was the reward for this guy, and this was the reward for that guy. So then it became lobbying as to how much any individual was entitled to as a share. Next shot, please. And now we get into the final resting places of the participants. This is the Booth family obelisk marking the site of where the Booth family plot is. And this is in Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore. You'll see that the names of the entire Booth family, including John Wilkes, are on the obelisk. And by the way, the specific site where he's buried is a mystery. It's not marked. It's somewhere over there.
Is it within the plot?
I would imagine it's some, and that's an interesting story too. I mean, the bodies of the conspirators were originally buried in where Fort McNair is, and Booth's body, had an interesting traveling when they did the autopsy, and then ironically, his body at one point was being stored in the stable where his horse was kept next to Ford's Theater, because there was a mortuary next door. So I mean, this was, on one level, this was maybe Edwin M. Stanton getting in a final little jab by having his body stored where the horses were stabled. Next shot, please. This would be the grave of David Harold and his mother. This is in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. Next slide, another shot of the same shot. You can see it's not too well marked. Next slide. This is Mrs. Seward'S grave. She's buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Washington, D.C. And this is the gate to Mount Olivet Cemetery where she's buried. Next slide. St. Paul's Cemetery is somewhere in that cemetery is where George Atzerodt is buried, but the actual location is unknown. Next shot. Lewis Thornton Powell, attempted assassin of Secretary Seward. This is the marker at his gravesite. in Geneva Cemetery in Seminole County, Florida. Next shot. And that's the sign outside the Geneva Cemetery. Next shot. This would be one shot of the grave of Samuel Arnold. Next shot. That's the marker. He's also buried in Greenmount Cemetery. Booth, Arnold, and O'Loughlin are all buried in the same cemetery. Next shot. This would be Michael O'Loughlin's marker in Greenmount Cemetery. You can go through. There are several slides of this. And that's the gate to the cemetery. And this is where Dr. Mudd is buried, in the churchyard of St. Mary's with his wife. Ned Spangler, as I said, in my own opinion, he was the most innocent of all of them, and I think, notwithstanding everything else, the evidence of that is that he got the lightest sentence of all of them, too. He was only sentenced to, I think, 6 years. And again, erected by the Sarat and Dr. Samuel A. Mudd Societies. This is a nice organization down in that part of the country that really does a lot in terms of historical programming and raising awareness and doing tours of these kinds of events and providing headstones for people like Ned Spangler, who his grave was not properly marked until they did this. This is the grave of Dr. Charles Leal, who was the first physician to tend to Lincoln. He's actually a permanent resident of New York State. He's buried at Oakland Cemetery in Yonkers. And there's another shot of his headstone. This is the grave of Miss Laura Keene, the other star of the show that evening. She's also a permanent resident of New York State. She's actually buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, which is one of the great historical cemeteries in New York State. It's many famous people are buried there, including, off the top of my head, Governor DeWitt Clinton. And that's an interesting story. He was originally buried at Albany Rural, and then when they wanted to get this cemetery off the ground, they negotiated with descendants of his, and they disinterred his body from Albany Rural, and they reinterred it at Greenwood, because I think the idea was they wanted to create a kind of like a Westminster Abbey thing with a lot of prominent people. Leonard Bernstein is also buried in this cemetery. This is all Laura Keene's. Now this is William H. Seward's grave, which is located in Auburn, Fort Hill Cemetery in Cayuga County. And the next shot is his son, who was Assistant Secretary of State, Frederick W. Seward. He was seriously wounded by Lewis Powell, repeatedly whacking him over the head with the pistol. So he's buried in the same plot right next to his dad. And this is the grave of Edwin M. Stanton. He's in Oak Hill Cemetery in Washington, D.C. Another shot of the same Stanton obelisk. In this picture, you can actually read the inscription. And one of the great ironies, too, I told you that he was involved in the impeachment of Johnson. He also, Grant put him up to be Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, but he died before he could take the assignment. So this is Allan Pinkerton's grave. The all-seeing eye. He's buried in Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, Cook County, Illinois. And you see it's an interesting, he was an immigrant to America. I always find these things fascinating. He's born in Glasgow, Scotland, and he comes to the country and on the basis of his detective work makes a name for himself to the point now where his name is synonymous with detective work. And that's the headstone, Allan Pinkerton. Which brings us to the last and most honored site, the burial place of the 16th president. This is in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield, Illinois. It's a large obelisk. Statues depicting Lincoln at various points in his career are inside, and also the Civil War is depicted. And the statue that you see the bust that you see in front. The nose is bright gold, but people rub it for luck. So visitors come in and they rub the nose for luck, and that's why the nose is a different color from the rest of the bust. Next slide. It's a larger depiction. This bust was actually made by Gutzon Borglum, who's most famous for being the artist who carved Mount Rushmore. And the next shot, getting even closer where you can actually read. It says, original in Hall of Fame, Washington, D.C., Gutzon Borglum sculptor. And this is the sarcophagus inside. There actually was a plot to steal Lincoln's body. And this was supposed to go down on election night, 1876. And so the current resting place that Lincoln is in is a vault that's actually below probably 12 feet of concrete beneath this empty sarcophagus. And that was put in its final resting place after the turn of the 19th century, the early 20th century. And there was a fellow by the name of Fleetwood Linley, who was about 13 years old. And the last thing that they did before they planted him and put the concrete over it was to remove any doubt about whether or not his body had actually been stolen. They opened the casket to take one last look. And his body had been so well preserved and mummified for the long trip from Washington, the long summertime and springtime trip from Washington, that he was still recognizable when they opened the casket. And so Fleetwood Linley, when he died in 1963, 1964, somewhere in there, he was the person who could lay claim to being the last living person to have looked upon the face of Abraham Lincoln. Next slide, please. I think this is the last slide. It gives you a sense of how the sarcophagus is presented. When you visit the Lincoln tomb, it's very interesting because you have to walk. There's like a square pattern, and this is in the middle. And as you reach each corner of the hallway, there's a statue of Lincoln at a different point in his career. So there's young Lincoln, Prairie lawyer Lincoln, New York, Cooper Union Lincoln, and then Lincoln as president. It's a very interesting site. And I think that's the last slide.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.